Okay, I guess we'll get started. Thank you all for joining. We appreciate you taking the time. Let us know in the chat. Let us know in the chat where you're coming from. It'd be interesting to know how international we are. Please, that would be very cool. Appreciate it. So we're going to be doing a talk today on avoiding the design system death spiral. This is the term that the CEO of Rangle kind of coined, and I liked the idea of it. I threw it into ChatGPT, and the background you see there is what came out, and I was pretty happy with the results. So I hope you enjoy what we're about to talk about here. There's a lot that we've learned over the years about design systems and why they succeed and why they fail, and hopefully we can illuminate some of that for you all. Just to start off, Arseny, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, I'm Arseny. I'm one of the technical directors in Rangle, based in Amsterdam. Worked on several design systems. Man, I'm not good at the intros, so I'll wrap up with that.
That's pretty good. He's fairly talented. I'm Mike Costanzo. I'm the SVP of Product and Design at Rangle. I've been focusing a lot on design systems, working with clients or prospective clients to understand where their design systems are and what's happening with them. A lot of people come to us with their design systems in some state of disarray or it's being stuck in some way. And what we'll talk about is how that happens and what the trends we've seen over time. The one nice thing about being at Rangle, which is a front end software consultancy, is that we see a lot of the same problems over and over again across different companies and different industries, and we get to kind of take multiple at bats with trying to solve those problems. So we've been doing design systems for 5+ years now, starting with Uniqlo many years ago, and that's evolved over time, and the industry's evolved, and knowledge around that's evolved, and we're still learning to this day. And we're going to talk about something I think that has distilled into a few hopefully actionable things that you can do in your design system endeavors. So what is the death spiral? The death spiral in my mind is kind of best articulated in this kind of narrative. The loads of planning and excitement and opinions early on with the start of any design system project. Months or years later, piles of unused components exist and nobody seems to really be using them much. Things start to really stall out and adoption actually declines. And you just realize the team is rebuilding their app using Material UI. We've seen this happen a few times now. Eventually, funding and interest start to dry up, leading to tough questions, few answers, and maybe even layoffs. A little later, the whole cycle starts again with new leadership in place. So I hope that resonates with at least some of you that have been through this before. It's an aggregation of a very common story that we see in when talking to companies about design systems and starting to understand the history of their attempts at design systems. The issue is design systems are hard, and I think that statement above kind of verifies this challenge with design systems that we see over and over again. But the problem is that they're not a nice to have. For digital businesses at scale, design systems are essential. There is really no good alternative, and I'll get into why that is at a high level. So as the number of teams increases, productivity decreases. So there's time-consuming specifications, duplication of work, which is a huge aspect. Just recently we had a company who had 3-4 different types of date pickers across their product suite. You can imagine the amount of time and effort wasted in doing that over and over again, and that applies to all kinds of problems, more or less complicated than that. And this idea that the only opportunity to verify the UI is working correctly is at the end of this build cycle. And this results in a high load on QA to kind of do this verification. So you get this kind of, as things scale, productivity starts to slow, and that picks up speed and compounds over time. And it's unavoidable, I think, is the other aspect, unless you have a design system. As the number of teams increases, the customer experience can suffer, right? So you get this idea of design fragmentation. You have designers, product teams working with developers on different contexts across different parts of the application. Often they're not really talking to each other, and they're solving the same problem in different ways, without any reusability across that solution. A lot of teams lack specialized skills at scale, right? It's really hard to scale a company and keep the bar on talent as high as needed in the early stages of the company. So you have to kind of mitigate this kind of lack of specialized skills to make high-end experiences. And with the number of people working on different parts of the experience in isolation, there's just a lack of integration across the experiences, and that starts to show in customer feedback, or sometimes even in executives wondering why there are so many different ways to do a particular thing across their applications. So that's kind of what happens. That's why this idea of design systems is even required at scale, because these things start to fragment the experience and productivity decreases. I'll just do a quick overview of how we think about design systems here, because I think even that, I've seen people have very wide range of notions about what a design system is. So we think about it as the systems in the operation. So the system itself is the design kit, or some design artifacts, the component library, and then there's supporting documentation. On the operation side, you need these things to actually make the design system work and be effective. So there's this idea of automated workflows that make it easy for the design system to be used. There's team collaboration and governance around how the design system changes over time. And then there's this idea of marketing and adoption strategy, which I think is really critically important. One of the things we're going to talk a lot about in the next few slides. So there are three truths about design systems that we want to talk to that give context and some framing around what we're interested in kind of focusing on in this talk. So truth one, design system initiatives have limited time to create a return on investment. So this idea that the design system is a funded experience is really important, and what you do about it is really critical. So all initiatives within a large organization have some kind of funding attached to it, some kind of way of determining who gets funded, whether that's sales and expense projections, or year-over-year comparisons, or ROI. And you might not see this in your day-to-day work, but this process deeply influences how organizations make decisions. And all the work in an organization is either budgeted or volunteered. The problem with volunteering, and a lot of design systems do start in this way because teams become frustrated with the way things are working and take their own initiative, is they start to burn out, and volunteer-driven design systems tend to crumble without support from the larger organization. Successful design systems are backed by their organizations, and the size of the funding should match the stage of the design system's evolution. So I think this is an important point, is that too much too soon can be just as detrimental to a design system as no funding at all, because you kind of get crushed under the weight of expectations, and it tends to fill the room with too many people, which leads to too many opinions and too much communication overhead. So the model that we think is really good is to think about design systems like you would a startup or a product within a startup. They're funded in stages, right? You have this idea of seed, Series A, Series B, etc. If the team delivering that product or building out that product doesn't show progress at any of these stages, they don't move forward, and they're naturally kind of wind down because there's not a shown value or product market fit for the funding, and the funding moves to another initiative. So design systems really should be thought about from at least within the team building them in the same way. This idea of showing value, showing it fast, and having a kind of MVP mindset to how you build your design system at the beginning. Truth two is design system value is realized when consuming teams ship production using its components. So when organizations grow at a certain point, product teams stop talking to each other or have a chat. The challenge is in talking to each other and making those connections. And then they start to build the same thing over and over again. We've talked about this already. Design systems serve to reverse this pattern. They exist to get teams who don't typically talk to each other to build products the same way. I think that's really interesting and an important point. It's really a communication tool in a way. It's not about just consistency or branding or user experience. Those metrics are really hard to tie to a return on investment for your funding. Design systems really need to make teams go faster by avoiding rework. Building things faster is not valuable if those things themselves are not valuable. And design systems are only valuable if it helps ship valuable things to production. It has to be part of a live product to realize its value. The thing that we typically see is people building in isolation, or building a lot of components, thinking that they need to build the complete design system before it's used, and that's usually a key anti-pattern that we see. So building the right thing and building it small and vertical slicing is something that's really important. We'll get into more detail on that in a bit. Let me go on to the next one. So truth three, getting teams to ship using a design system is an exercise in change management and requires an adoption strategy. I think this is really critical when thinking about design systems, is that they are designed to change how people work, right? They are a new way of designing and developing products. And that change is really the most challenging aspect of design systems. It's much more challenging than the technical changes. Teams will not use a design system just because it exists. More components won't solve this problem, and generally it makes it worse, especially early on. And some teams are more likely to adopt design systems than others. So you need to think about identifying which teams will be best to partner with early on. And this has more to do with corn than you might think. I'm not sure if this is familiar to anyone, but this is a visualization called the diffusion of ideas. And this was created by two researchers who were studying farmers and their adoption of new technologies, new types of corn, new types of farm equipment, and how those new technologies, ideas kind of permeated across the landscape of farmers over time. And the interesting thing that they came up with in this is that they found these kind of psychographic profiles of people within this kind of adoption life cycle, or this diffusion of ideas. And some of these might sound familiar to you if you're familiar with ideas of lean startup, and have worked and read a lot of literature around that. It's a very common kind of convention. So there's this idea of innovators, early adopters, and the early majority. The early majority is where you see the majority of adoption happen. There's a late majority, and then there's laggards or non-adopters. So this concept was quite interesting, and then reused by people in a number of different ways to describe technology adoption outside of just farming, and in all types of adoption, and really popularized in this book by Jeffrey Moore called Crossing the Chasm. Now, Moore did borrow these ideas from some other people that he was working with, but he really was the one responsible for popularizing them. I won't go into the torrid history of it all, but he had this idea of the chasm. And the main point here in this model is that there is a difference between early adopters and the early majority, but each progressive kind of profile serves as a reference for the other one to adopt the technology. But the difference between early adopters and the early majority is the widest. And often what happens with new innovation is it's not able to cross that barrier or that chasm between the early adopters and the pragmatists. So to overcome this idea of getting to the mainstream market, you have to find people willing to take risks on an immature technology. And then second, you have to make the jump from the early adopters to the early majority. And this idea of the chasm within the Geoffrey Moore's model it really connected with me when I heard the term the design system death spiral. And what I started to realize is I started to see more and more companies dealing with design systems and their either successes or failures, was that there was some analogy here in this model that really resonated and worked well. And we're going to talk about how thinking about this model, thinking about early adopters and early majority, thinking about them differently will help you in your success of building the design system. And it really connects with how we think about building design systems successfully when we engage with our clients. So let's get into avoiding the design system death spiral. I'll hand it over to my partner, Arseny.
So death spiral is design system project not getting sufficient traction, becoming irrelevant, and closing down only to be restarted in a new attempt. And that happens again and potentially again, et cetera. To avoid the death spiral, you have to overcome the two hurdles. You have to start right, and you have to scale right. You start right by identifying your early adopters and building exactly what they need at exactly the right time. And you scale right by creating a stable and easy to use product while onboarding and supporting a gradually expanding set of teams. This is following what Mike has just been saying about the crossing chasm model. To start right, you have to focus on the pilot, and you have to focus on adoption at all cost. You pick a pilot team. These are your early adopters. They may be enthusiastic about design systems, have a tech stack representative of the wider org, they're operating in a visible space, etc. You pick the pilot by maximizing the impact of that team's success and maximizing the probability of that team's success, right? So the more enthusiastic they are about the design systems, the likely they are to use it, the more visible they are to the organization, the likely other people to follow suit, etc. Of course, in the organization, you have a limited number of teams, so you find the best fit and go with that. Once you have a pilot, you have to get really close to them. You have to understand exactly what they're building, what their market is, who their customers are, and most importantly, what their plans are. You need to know their plans to be able to predict what the team is going to need, because it's not enough to give them components. You have to give them components they don't already have at the time they need them for the next feature. Teams often start by building something like a button. Nobody cares about a button because most product teams already have them. So you have to be providing something that the team doesn't already have at the time they need it to build the next feature, and that's how you get them to like you and to trust you. So you pick a pilot, you establish really close proximity with that team, you start predicting their needs, and you build exactly what they need. And you treat your design system like a product. A design system is not some collection of best practices. You have to build the right components at the right time. And you do that by working backwards from the predictions you make about the pilot team. And you select what you're going to build, and you build just enough infrastructure processes, foundational items to make it happen. Don't define all tokens. Don't build all the atoms. You start cutting vertical slices, build just enough to ship that component the pilot team needs. And doing this allows you to deliver working software and allows you to collect real feedback on the things you're delivering. People often think that building a design system is this process of going left to right. You define all the tokens, then you build all the atoms, you build the patterns, and then you build the features, etc. This could theoretically work. The problem with this, it postpones shipping to production. When you have tokens, you can't actually ship to production. You're not helping the pilot team deliver. You're just working on some abstractions. So instead, we recommend doing the shakeout. You select a thing you want to build, you figure out exactly what you need to build for that component and build just that. And next time you select another component and you figure out what you need to build that you don't already have. And over time, you will have to build less and less new things. You will shake out less and less from the goal components you're trying to build. And that creates a repeatable pattern how you can approach building the components. And you have to try and move from pushing to pulling. So in logistics, there's a distinction between push and pull processes. Pull process is when a customer requests the item from a supplier. An example of a pull process is going to a supermarket, right? You pick what you need, the supermarket replenishes the shelves, and the process repeats. Another is Kanban in the original sense. A person's assembling a car, they have a set of cards representing sub-assemblies. They bring the cards to the supplier gives back a widget, person installs the widget on the card, gets the card back and brings it to a supplier. So that way they pull the supply towards themselves. And in a brand new design system, you're operating a push process. You're trying to predict what people will need, and you're trying to get it to them in time. You're pushing people to use the components to the point of being annoying. And you should aim to migrate to a pull process where people trust you enough to request the work and expect it to be done in time to build a feature. And this frees your capacity to run the prediction game on another team. So you get more reliable, people trust you more, and so they start requesting things of you. And as they request things of you, you can stop predicting what they need, and you will know exactly what they need. And that allows you to focus on the other team.
I'll just interject here, Arseny, because I think there's a point here. I want to put a third point. It's really an exercise in building trust, and I think that's really fundamentally important in this. The trust building that you can deliver the quality and the things needed is a critical aspect of design system success, obviously. So this is we're going to have Dan Mall come in and talk. So if any of you are familiar with design systems, you probably are familiar with Dan Mall and his work. I think it's interesting that the things that we've been seeing is also reflected in some of the people that have been working on this independently of us over time. So Dan's going to come in and talk about his view on this in relation to design systems and getting them adopted.
What do teams use?
Oh.
You got it.
All right.
What's next? This is probably the single biggest pitfall that I see teams walk into blindly. What do teams usually do at this point? They start making components. No, that is a terrible idea. Why is this so bad? Because you just promised your head of product that you would help them with the roadmap. So help them with the roadmap. Now, how would you normally do that? If you weren't doing a design system, you would go and check out a backlog and you'd pick off whatever's ready and start working on that thing. And that is still a great thing to do here. So many teams try to do something that's more design system-y because they feel like, well, we're doing design system stuff, so we got to do something design system-y. And instead, you don't want to do that. Just do your regular old product stuff. The best way to grow your design system is to continue to focus on creating customer value.
So hopefully you've selected a pilot team, you've aligned your workflow with their needs, and you get them to rely on you for delivery. And at that point, you try to scale. And basically, you repeat the same process with more teams. You embed with the next team, predict what they need, and supply it. But now you already have a few components built, so hopefully you get faster at supplying the right things at the right time. However, the people you are scaling to, they're probably not the most enthusiastic in your organization about design systems. They have more maybe technological challenges, so you start expanding the requirements of the system. Keep focusing on a small number of teams to not overflow your capacity to support them, right? So as you onboard more and more teams with slightly different requirements, you will have to support them. And if you onboard too much people, you will not be able to support them. And that destroys trust, which is a problem. And also avoid overstaffing your team beyond the roadmap that's populated by the pull process and by the prediction game, because that is a waste of budget, right? That's just building things for the sake of building or not building efficiently.
Yeah, I'll add, I think I missed this in kind of the crossing the chasm analogy, but one of the key points of crossing the chasm within that framework is establishing a beachhead, which excuse the wartime kind of analogies, but they're just rampant in this industry. But the idea is that you need to really focus your efforts, build that trust, establish trust within a small segment of that early majority, or sorry, late majority, and then expand from there. What we've seen in some cases where this idea of the pilot is kind of becoming well known within the industry as a good way to start. We've seen teams struggle after that, and that's why this model started to really become interesting to me, because I was trying to understand why they struggled. The fundamental aspect of it is they took the success of the pilot and then thought that meant that they had the capability to expand more broadly into other teams within the organization. And if you remember what I said about the crossing the chasm, those early adopters are very different and their needs are very different than the early majority. And you really have to think about that when scaling, and think small and then think compounding interest over time. So by staying small, you're staying focused, you're building things that are valuable, and doing that shakeout process, essentially your design system starts to grow organically around this concept of value. So that's the beachhead mentality.
Another thing that changes as you start scaling is you're supporting more and more requirements, and you're supporting more and more components. And if initially you could get away with maintaining your processes manually, and in fact you should, because optimizing the process too early takes away from your ability to just deliver value to production. Once you're scaling, you cannot get away with manual process anymore. And compared to early adopters, the early majority has a significantly reduced tolerance for issues. The early adopters, they tolerate risk, right? They want to try what you're building so they can tolerate some discomfort. As you scale, most people are not going to tolerate that discomfort. You have to make sure that you spend time designing the APIs, because changing APIs is expensive. You have to keep in mind the backwards compatibility, and keep in mind that once somebody starts using something, you cannot easily change it. Mistakes do happen, so if you do have to change the APIs, make sure that you have a deprecation process. The idea here is that you ship at high quality and avoid alienating the consuming teams. You have to preserve the trust that you're generating, because otherwise people can turn to other solutions. And you have to keep driving the adoption. You have to you can't set into the mentality that if you build it, people will come and use it, right? You have to keep marketing what you're doing. You have to keep making it easy so that people understand how the system works without having to go to you. There is a list astonishment principle, for example. It means that the system should be predictable based on the previous interaction. So if I take a new component from the design system, I should be able to understand how it works without looking at documentation, just because I've already used components from a design system. So the same thing should work the same way across the entire system. And this makes it easier for people to use it, and also reduces the support needs. And when it comes to support, documentation is not the goal. Supporting consuming teams is the goal, and documentation is just one way to do it. So our advice is keep humans available for questions and use documentation to optimize answering questions. And you have to keep reminding people of design system achievements and of progress, and of all the cool things you're doing to help to maintain that momentum to allow you to expand to other teams, so you're already aware and you're already looking forward to. Change management is hard. You have to approach it very deliberately, and you have to focus on supporting the teams you onboard. And that's all we've got. Focus on the adoption at all costs. Treat your design system like a product, and move from pushing to pulling. And that's how you start with the early adopters. And as you scale, you establish a beachhead. Keep focusing on a small number of teams. Prioritize stability and keep driving the adoption. Questions?
I know that might seem simple and sound simple, and that is really the point. I think the complexity of design system creates this kind of inertia towards more complexity within the solution to design systems. And I think everything that we've done and the successes that we had is really around just kind of keeping things simple and focused. And that generally leads to a much higher success rate within design systems. There are still huge barriers to overcome within organizational kind of complexity, but that doesn't get solved by making things bigger in our view. I'll leave it open to any questions.
There's still scope for complexity.
Yeah.
There's still scope for complexity. It's just this conversation is mainly about focus, right? What you prioritize at what stage.
Is there anything anyone's unclear about or wants us to loop back into, or feels that they've had an experience that's very different? I'd love to know. Again, we have our experience based on our clients and the work that we do, but that might not be reflective of the entire ecosystem. Yeah, if you want to unmute and ask and talk, please.
Right. Well, let's give it another minute, and then I guess we're going to wrap up.
If you haven't read Crossing the Chasm, we did a workshop around this talk a while ago in Ireland, and I was surprised that no one in the room of 30 people was familiar with the concept. So, like, if you're not and you're building software, I think it's a really great, like one of the cornerstone books. It's a mental model that served me really well in my career, and I continues to today. So I really would advocate for at least reading a blog post about it. There's a lot of stuff on it, but the book is quite good.
Right, no questions. I am guessing that, oh, sorry. What are the indicators that you're at the chasm when it comes to design systems?
Oh, I think Rand maybe came in a bit later. The chasm is really like this kind of continuing deacceleration of the design system. So Arseny, can you maybe go back to the narrative?
This one?
Where, oh, it's at the very beginning. No, at the very beginning.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So this is how we started. There's this idea that things start to stall, right? That you've built a lot. You have a bunch of components, but no one seems to be using them. Adoption stalls, essentially adoption stalling, right? You really want to be thinking like a startup and thinking about like hockey stick curves, right? It's slow, and then, you know, at some inflection point, your design system gets an uptake where a lot of teams rely on it. It becomes a de facto way of building products, and that's really hard to achieve, but traction and adoption become the really most important signs. If you like it, as the story I wrote here, if you start to see other teams choosing alternatives to the design system, that's definitely one of the signs that you're in this kind of chasm or death spiral of a design system. If adoption remains flat and only within one team, that's a sign. If you are thinking about adoption in a really trivial way, which in fact, we see a lot where like if any team is using any component within the design system, adoption is like 100% for that team. That's a really kind of problematic indicator, because what happens when those kinds of ideas of adoption are what is the expectation is generally teams will integrate an icon pack, maybe a button, maybe a few input forms, and that's it. And so you have, and that's a fraction of this larger system that you've built. This tends to happen when you start to build from the atomic components up, rather than from the value-based shakeout process that we described in the talk here. Rand, I'm not sure exactly where you came into the conversation, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, a bit more formal way to answer that question is we recommend measuring adoption as a components used in the code base as a percentage of all components used. So your product uses uses components 100 times to build a feature, and the design system supplies 20 usages of that 100. So you're at 20%. If that number stops growing at the position that's not close to maybe 80, 70, 100%, then you're at the chasm, right? Because you have some adoption, hopefully, but the growth has stalled.
It's essentially not enough to cross over into the rest of your organization and have the impact that was promised with the design system, or that the design system should essentially have. And really, this does come down to the idea that it is an exercise in change management, and that's incredibly hard. Most teams aren't even thinking about it or have the capabilities to kind of make that process happen. So the idea of starting small and staying small until you're capable and have those skills and have that kind of investment needed is really important in that avoidance. I hope that helped. I don't know if anyone else had anything. I will say that we do have an events page, and we have a really great talk coming up with, how come I can't send this? Maybe Jasper, you can. We have a really great talk about AI and front end coming up, I think in a couple of days. So please check that out. Attend that. The people doing that talk are basically geniuses, and I think it will.
We have a fantastic question for Chloe. From Chloe.
Go, Chloe.
Yeah. So if we're prioritizing the components that teams are going to need in the near future and build just those, how can we maintain? Basically, how do you do research on that limited basis, and how do you maintain consistency for the long term? I have an answer. I can start.
Yeah, please go.
I think the idea here is that you don't really. You're operating at a very early stage at this point. So our recommendation is to do this not at the stage when you're scaling and you need consistency across everything, right? You're operating with a particular team, and you're just trying to get traction. So don't optimize for things that happen far down the line. Make sure that you get the traction. Redoing the work is not that painful if the system is adopted and you have the budget and support from the organization. The alternative is much more painful, that you do things right but nobody's using them, right? Between those two, make sure that people are using the system first, and then you'll be able to rework it to be better.
I think that last point. Oh, sorry. Go, Arseny. Go. Sorry.
At the same time, you probably have some expert knowledge. You probably you should still try and do that homework, and you still strive to do things better. It's just a conversation more about priorities rather than right. Well, we're not saying discard it altogether, right? Just prioritize building things rather than prioritize adoption rather than building things right.
Yeah, I was going to add that having a design system adopted should make changing the brand easier, right? So, this is something actually we've been talking about a lot in thinking about this, because often a design system is bundled with a rebrand, and that kind of increases the stakes in a way that maybe is a negative towards the design system actually having impact. If you are building your design system well and it's adopted, changing brand through tokens and componentized UI should be much easier. So one of the benefits of teams leveraging and adopting design systems at a high level of adoption is rebranding should be easier, or modifications to the brand should be easier, because you're essentially doing what happens in Figma. You have a master component that is being reused, and when you change that component, the styling of that component, it permeates throughout the throughout all the designs using that component. And the same applies for when you make a change to a component within a design system, is that they should get that change to styling and look and feel for free. I think there are UX patterns and things like that that kind of complicate the matter, but hopefully that helped answer some of your question. Yeah, it adds pressure, absolutely, to the point where we've talked about ways to mitigate that by actually not involving the rebrand as part of some engagement that we've done with clients. So it's literally a hot topic right now within our teams.
And I guess to follow up on this conversation, do your research and do prioritize stability just at the later stage, right? When you have enough traction, enough support from an organization, basically enough budget to do that work, absolutely prioritize it, right? It is crucial when you have a system that's running that's that the organization relies on. So by no means we're advocating to not do it. It's just don't do it too early.
I think the other thing is, if that's the case, generally that means that there is a siloed approach to what the design system is and will do, right? And if it's a rebrand, it's generally, in my experience, tied to the design team being the owner of the design system and thinking of it as a way to finally get design right, rather than this idea of changing how product design and development work in concert and being cross-functional in that execution. So I think that's also something that is a pattern that I've seen in this idea of the rebrand plus the design system. It kind of indicates siloing of ownership of a design system, which is generally, I think, one of those other failure points that we didn't go super deep on in this talk, but maybe should.
My view on how to approach things is very much tainted, I guess is the right word, by what I think a design system is. And in my opinion, design system is not a design thing, and it's not a technical thing, right? Design system is an organizational tool. When you have multiple product teams, they tend to not talk to each other, and they tend to build the same thing over and over again. And a design system is an attempt at getting product teams to ship faster through avoiding rework between those teams, right? And if you think about it in those terms, then yes, it has to be good quality. Yes, you have to think about the suitability of how suitable the components are for long term, how on brand they are, how uniform they look and feel, etc., etc. But that's secondary to reducing rework. And maybe it's a bit too mercantile of a point of view, but it seems to have worked well for me so far. Certainly in conversations about budget.
Absolutely. Great. Awesome. We have a couple more minutes if there's not if there's something else anyone would like to dive into, please post it up now, or we will call it time and hopefully see you again. Like I said, please go to the events page. The talk that we're going to do on front end and AI is going to be obviously a topic that's really of the moment, but I think we'll have an interesting take on making those things practical. And like I said, the two people that are doing that talk are really at the cutting edge of thinking about those things. So it will be definitely worth your time. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate the questions. Really appreciate you taking the time and sticking around. And please reach out if you have any more questions or other things you want to talk about in relation to design systems. We're hopefully going to be continuing on this saga of actually getting into the details of how you do this next. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much.
Take care.